This show is listener supported. You can join us and help our show grow to support more adoptees by going to adopteeson.com/partner. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 128, Blake. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Today, the creator of Not Your Orphan is sharing their story with us. Blake Gibbins is here. Blake and I talk about what happened 3 years ago to kick him out of the fog. We discuss grief and some major losses Blake experienced earlier this year. And we move into a discussion about activism, cognitive dissonance, and what it means to be queer and an adoptee. And we'll wrap up with some recommended resources. And as always, everything we'll be talking about today are over on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Blake Gibbins. Welcome, Blake.
Hi, Haley. Thanks for having me.
Would you please start the way everyone does, and would you share your story with us?
Oh, yes. What a big question, huh?
Yeah, no pressure.
No pressure. Well, my name's Blake, and I run a platform called Not Your Orphan, which is a YouTube channel, but I also have a Facebook page, and I'm on other social media. I'm a graduate student through Goddard College in Vermont, and I'm sure nobody's ever heard of it, but if you haven't, you should definitely check it out. Amazing school. And I am in a graduate degree it's individualized, but I'm studying child welfare history and contemporary adoptee rights issues, like policy, but also social belief structures about adoption and child welfare in general. So that's kind of the impetus for how I got to where I'm at with having the platform Not Your Orphan. And that's a little bit about me. We could go into more personal. I tend to need to be pried open. Yeah.
Let's do it. Take us back. You're adopted. How did that happen?
Well, I'm a domestic adoptee from Houston, Texas. Ooh, Texas. And I was born in 1992. We left Texas when I was I think 2 months. Houston is, I'm sure, great, but it was a scary place for my parents at the time. I was actually born on the day of Hurricane Andrew. And my parents' car was stolen the same day I was hours away from being born. So we're like, no, we're going back to Iowa. So I was raised in Iowa, very small town, 4,000 people. That might be big to some people, but yeah. And I didn't really start my journey with adoption until 3 years ago, which I've said before on some parts of my platform that might sound odd to non-adopted people. Be like, haven't you lived adoption your whole life? Why are you just quote unquote discovering it? But yeah.
So what happened 3 years ago that changed for you?
Well, I originally was an architecture student, and I love art and design. I was a theater kid, a choir kid, and I just couldn't stand the direction that the program was going when I was there. So I left and traveled a few years, decided that wasn't sustainable. I was going to need a degree. So I found this school out in Boulder, Colorado, and finished a couple of the last years of my undergrad with a peace studies degree. Boulder, Colorado is so expensive if you're coming from someplace like the Midwest. So I was struggling with houselessness and, really, really struggling with income. And some individual took me in. I was living in a basement under a sewing machine, and I was helping them with their nonprofit working with veterans. And we went to a symposium one day before my second semester of this school out in Boulder, Naropa University. And I thought I was there to learn. It was with Dr. Gabor Mate. Some people know about him in the psychology community. I thought I was there to learn about veteran PTSD, or about PTSD, so that I could better work with the veterans in the community that I was a part of with this nonprofit. But there was a moment where there was a question to the whole community. I think there was 300 people there for the symposium, about if anybody had a childhood or had grown up with symptoms of trauma, but not necessarily a story to connect it to. And like a ghost, I just raised my hand, and he saw me. Of course, I was the only hand in the room, and started probing about my life and different things, and we just couldn't get there. I saw him getting frustrated, and I had no idea what to give him. I just knew that if you were to go through, a national list of child trauma symptoms, I had a lot of them. So when he was about to hand the mic over, turn the discussion, whatever, sort of said I was adopted as like a last thought, like it was something inconsequential, and yet some deep part of me was like, this is important to say, I guess. And he just looked at me and he was like, how is that not a trauma? And, you can feel like the little glass like shattering in the brain. Like, what? Nobody in my life had ever talked about it in those sort of bookends before. And he proceeded to talk about his life growing up during World War II and being separated from his mother in infancy and the impact that that's had on his neurological wiring, etc. And at the end of his sort of personal analogy, he turned to me again and he said, I just want you to know you've earned your suffering. You've earned your suffering. And I broke down. The tear ducts just would not stop running in front of all of this room of strangers. And that was kind of my first, like, what's going on here? Why have I never cried about this before? Why is this so important right now? And so that began shaping kind of my inquiries around my undergraduate thesis work, which really started with, well, where does adoption come from? Like, what is it exactly as an institution? And what I began to find with the people who were out there who had written professionally on this for years, but maybe aren't necessarily mainstream voices, was this story of just horrible things that I think a lot of people don't understand. And so it really, that day at that symposium was really the kickoff for me to begin diving deep into all this.
That's so powerful to hear that from someone. And then, so you talk about looking into it academically, but what did that do for you personally? Were you examining, what does this mean for me, Blake?
Let me remember, what time was that? I started my thesis semester when I met my best friend who I live with. And by the way, I am a total proponent for intergenerational friendships. My best friend is 30 years older than me, and we're like family we never could have imagined having. But this poor individual...
I thought you were going to say 30 years old.
No.
Because you said intergenerational and then you said 30 and I was like, excuse me. Okay, sorry. Go on.
I mean, I better not. I just turned 27, so yeah. No, he's 30 years older than me, and in some ways that's incredible to honor that. In some ways you hardly notice, but I think there's so much to gain in intergenerational relationships. But this poor individual came to my life right at the brink of everything collapsing, unpacking, growing, but also, in my brain. And so, oh my gosh, my thesis semester, I wouldn't wanted to be around me. I was just, my grasp on reality was, I don't want to say it was slipping, but it was definitely a major change. That's for sure.
Were you looking back at your childhood with a different lens, or were you just thinking about things you had maybe struggled with and thinking, oh, maybe that's the reason why? What was that grasp on reality? Like, what was that? Yeah.
It's a little difficult to answer because I made a post the other day and I said that, it's my opinion, but I think race can isolate adoptees in one of two ways, either by making it really easy for everyone around them to forget that it happened or reminding them every day that it did. And as a white adoptee in a white family who looks at photos of myself with my family, it's like a trick on the mind, I look like them kind of in some photos, but also internally it's like I have nothing outward that's telling me how I feel. That was a little confusingly worded, but so I didn't grow up thinking about it necessarily a lot. I mean, I had a lot of thoughts that other adoptees, tell me in conversations, like thinking on, because I knew I was adopted. I knew I was adopted since I was like 6. Which I think a really poignant thing to say is when my adopted mother first told me I was adopted, I didn't talk to her for a day. I was like 5 or 6. And the next thing I had to say to her was I was taking a bath the next day and I came out and I said, is everyone I know going to die? And so I knew that it was impacting me, but I didn't really have a dialogue going with anybody about that. The first adoptee I ever met formally, who introduced themselves as another adoptee, I was 24. So when we talk about that time in my life where I was unraveling sort of the history and corruption involved in sort of the roots of some of these systems, how it affected me personally is hard to describe because it wasn't linear. It was really like a volcanic explosion that I've been sort of backwards unraveling to today.
Okay. So you're doing a lot of processing. 3 years in the grand scheme of things is not very long. And you've come a long way in 3 years to becoming this very outspoken person.
Sure.
What about adoptee activism in general and other things as well? What has happened in those 3 years as you've processed, as you've actually, researched this and literally are doing a degree about it? What's been happening in your personal life? Did you think about searching for a biological family? What are some of those things that have happened?
When I was 16, my first mother sent me, and that's the language I used, first parents. I know people use different words or terminology. She sent me a package when I was 16, but we had no contact. I'd never known what she looked like. I didn't know that I had half siblings, one that was actually a part of her family before I was adopted. So I had a sibling who was 2 years older. That was interesting. But the way I love my adoptive family, some people who follow me on the platform know that my father passed away in March of this year. It's been kind of a hard year, but back then, not really having any support to consider that there's anything to ever think about trauma-wise with adoption or that there's potentially anything wrong with the process at all, and how outcomes play for the adoptee. My parents just, they were who they were at the time. When that package came, my mother was very distraught. She was very concerned I'd reached out without talking to her, to this individual that I knew nothing about. And it was just really scary seeing her emotional reaction at the time. So I internalized that and decided I was never going to ever talk about adoption.
What was in the package?
It was a letter from both my half-sister, 2 years younger than me, and my mother and my first mother, and some photos. And gosh, it never gets old. I mean, adoptees know adoptees. It's just, for those of us that are lucky enough, I think more often domestically for sure, to be able to see those we're genetically related to, nothing compares to that feeling, regardless of attachment to stories or anything, what you know about this person. It was just one of the holiest moments of my life. And it was so hard to know that it was really hurting my mother back then. And so we never really talked about it. And until the last 3 years, I hadn't talked about it. But luckily, one thing happened, which was that my mother found out that her sister had been forced by my grandmother to give a child up for adoption during what we understand to be the scoop era, which isn't so definable, but arbitrarily between the 40s and 70s. And a niece reached out to her in, I think, 2015. And that really started to kind of change the dialogue between my mother and I, because she and my aunt were actually the ones that went to meet this individual. And just to hear how excited they were to meet a new family member, I think shook my mom a little bit. She was like, oh, okay. But also at that time, my maternal grandmother had reached out and tried to open dialogue. And so there was this slow rekindling of like, well, it's happening again. The discussion's coming. I don't really want to have it. I'm still this terrified little boy who doesn't want to hurt, their mother. But yeah, when this piece happened with going to the symposium and learning about the history, I don't know. I was an adult. I'd been away from home for a while, and I felt like it was finally time to talk about it. And I did end up searching for my first father. that was my way of protecting my mother. Like, oh, I won't go meet my first mother first, but my dad and I are kind of distant, so I'll go meet my first father first. And I did find him spring of 2017. And yeah, that was definitely driven by that moment, that sort of apex of things breaking open was, well, admitting that I really have always wanted to know, have always wanted to meet. And I guess how it's changed my personal life more since then is, I don't know, the more I learn, the more I learn. It's such a slow process of taking these really, really early parts of your brain and laying them out on the table and examining them. And I honestly, there's some adoptees that I've met that really just would prefer never to talk about it. And I understand why. It's not easy looking that deeply at yourself, especially, I was a newborn prearranged adoption. That's some early trauma to go all the way back and excavate. And so I'm lucky to have had some of the friends and community that I've had in order to do that. And I think that's really why I was able to start the platform that I have.
The sense I'm getting from you is you have very much split your personal exploration into your own adoption stuff versus your public activism to a certain extent.
Sure.
Is that safety wise?
I think so.
Okay. I just watched, a few weeks ago, I watched half of a video that you put up. And this morning I went back and I was like, oh, I gotta watch everything, make sure I'm familiar. And then I finished the video and you share some very personal, intimate details that I was really shocked by. And, you don't have to go into that story here. Mm-hmm. People can go in and watch it and you kind of unpack in greater detail. But why was that the thing that you really wanted to kind of open up? Because in your other videos and your other writing, it is that arm's length, look at this from a societal perspective, and of course, so important. And then you've got this other very vulnerable piece where you talk about GSA.
Yeah. Have you ever had those moments where it's as though the body gives you no choice? I think that's what happened for me with that specific piece. The GSA thing, people can go over to the Not Your Orphan platform on YouTube and watch the most recent video from like the end of September or something that I posted. It is very, very intense. I think you did well by separating it into two pieces, like watching it at different times, just to process.
And it wasn't even, I didn't even mean to be like, oh, I'm going to pause and come back. It was like, I have small children. I got interrupted. I didn't go back to it. Like, it wasn't like by choice. It just sort of happened that way.
But a good recommendation maybe too, because it is 30 minutes long and the end is quite, GSA is such a unique, interesting part of the whole adoption community discussion, but really just anything dealing with genetic separation, because this is something that can also be extended into, donor-born and surrogate-born individuals as well. But it really, really rocked my world in a big way to have met one of two characters that they were like my mythical, knightly, kingly, queenly figures, and have it not be that fairy tale. And just the anger and frustration about that alone. But then I'm not going to go into it too much here because I think the video actually does a really good job. And I will not shy away from the fact I script my videos. I have to. There's no other way. I get so nervous when talking to people. I ramble and it would be a totally different series, but I think it does a really good job. I will say that, of getting into the nuance of consent, of how different this sort of experience is for those who've been separated, what it means, and what it means if you participated but didn't necessarily give consent. I'm all about the intricacies. But it really rocked my world. And so I think I knew I was going to have to make a video on that at some point. It just felt like what needed to happen. And I wanted to bring my personal side to that because I didn't want anyone else to feel as alone as I did. And so I said, I'll do a little bit of self-sacrifice here and bring myself to the conversation so others don't necessarily feel as alone. Because that's something I wouldn't expect many people to come forward about with their face and name attached to it. So,
well, that's just it. I mean, I did do an episode on GSA, and I was like, she was like, oh, first of all, it has to be anonymous. And then I was like, yeah, but I don't know who's going to listen. So we should probably also change your voice. And my editor did a good job. And then I was still like, you can still kind of tell, like, if you knew the person, you know, like it was just, It was never enough. And so to see, you know, you share your experience, it's so powerful because it's you and you can see your face and you're really sharing from the heart, and to hear that it's from a place of you don't want anyone else to feel alone. And I mean, that's the whole reason I started this show, right? Like you don't get it if you haven't lived it. Right.
I mean, thank you for mentioning the video and also for what you said. I think that's definitely for your platform. And then it's also a theme that I want to carry forward in mine. I've been kind of clinical with my channel so far, but yeah, not wanting anyone else to be as alone or isolated. And it makes it really exciting right now. I think there's so many adoptees starting to come forward on social media mostly, but also in their communities with personal authorship, personal storyhood. And sometimes I sit and I get so worked up over injustice. I'm like, I want to go to DC right now. I want people to understand what this is. I mean, I'm sure I come off really aggressive on my channel, but I'm basically like Winnie the Pooh with a switchblade. Like, I'm just a little bit thorny. I'm a little bit thorny, but I'm really just like a big cuddle bear. Wanting people not to be so alone. Oh, so what I was going to say is, so I can get a little worked up of like, we're not moving fast enough with this movement. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of adoptees take on saviorship sometimes personally around like, I have to be the one to fix this. Some of your listeners will understand what I mean by saying that, I think. But really removing that onus and realizing that it's so important that many adoptees are at this point, because personal authorship is a lot of the times what's been lost to, you know, our adopted family's story of us, however well-meaning, and then society at large, of course. And so I don't know. I want to stop and appreciate just that we're on these things, helping people, wanting to help people not feel so alone or isolated is why we share.
Yes. Okay. So I have one more sort of personal question, and then let's get into the other advocacy stuff.
Yeah.
So you mentioned briefly that you lost your adoptive father earlier this year, and that was in, again, like a very unexpected way. So you've got a couple layers of grief about fathers. Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I think that I would say to anyone listening, if you are not an adoptee and you have an adoptee in your life, because I think there's some old statistic that's like 63% of people are connected to adoption in some way.
Yeah, I heard that.
I'm sure it's much higher. You know, I'm sure that I didn't necessarily meet the first adoptee at 24. There was somebody else. It's not an identity that is necessarily on the forefront of our lives, unless we put it there for some people. But I would say for those that are not adopted that are listening and have an adoptee in their world, understand that something which seems as, albeit hard, normal part of living is that people pass on. A lot of adoptees walk around with such complex grief already that things like this can really have a different flavor to them. we should respect anybody who's going through the grief process, but definitely, be there for your adoptee community members or those you're in relationship with, because I feel really lucky that I started my journey of kind of opening up my thoughts about adoption and what it's done for me, to me as an individual before this happened, because I fear what it would have meant to have that person gone before I'd ever started that journey. I know some people who haven't cared about talking about adoption at all, and then suddenly the adopted parents have passed, maybe in a tragic way, and a complete breakdown happens because themes around attachment, all these very deep personal things finally surface. And it was scary. I've walked around my whole life like doing everything possible not to be abandoned in any capacity. And here, one of the primary figures, two rulers in my life, the king and queen of my kingdom, mom and dad, was just gone so suddenly. And we had only just really begun developing a relationship. And it was hard. It is hard. But yeah, I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question head on. And I think I'm just avoiding that. I don't really know how to answer it. My relationship with fatherliness, there's a lot of potential to ruminate on the past and what I wish I could have had from either figure, but I don't think that would serve me, especially not since one is no longer with us. But I mean, thank you for talking about him. I don't get to talk about my dad a lot.
Well, you said you were sort of earlier, you said we weren't really that close. And then you said you were kind of starting to rebuild a relationship. Do you have like some memories of a conversation you had before he passed away that is really special to you?
I love my adopted family, and I feel like I get so annoyed because I feel like so many adoptees feel like they have to say, oh, I'm so grateful, or oh, I love my family. Really, I'm going to say for myself, it's nobody's business. I love my family. You don't need to know that just for me to say what I'm about to say. But there hasn't necessarily been a lot of engagement with my advocacy work, and I understand. I don't think they want to think about it. I mean, especially my adopted mother, I'm like, have you seen my well, yeah, I think no. We skirt the issue sometimes. But after my dad passed, I was back on his Facebook page, and he was the only one to share every single thing I did around advocacy. I think he was distant for many reasons that I don't have to go into in this episode, but I think that he always saw me, and I will always appreciate I will always appreciate how much of a support and ally he really was, even if he didn't express it that much. I think he was wowed by me as a human being, and I definitely feel that now that he's gone. In some ways, he's more here than ever.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And grief is so nonlinear, and
right.
We're talking about this year, and it was tumultuous to say the least, right? And oh man, don't Google your name. Jeez. You get some interesting.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that or no?
I mean, I think we're safe too. I'm not. Okay. There's nothing I have to say that's in any way implicating or like. Yeah, I was arrested earlier this year, one week after my father passed, for doing something people can definitely Google my name for. That is still. Oh my gosh, I don't think there's a date for that until next year now. But I keep trucking on. Yes, it's been a very interesting year, Haley. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, let's just leave it at that in case people Google you. There you go. I did know. Like, it's not like this big secret.
No. Yeah, I don't care.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Let's move into advocacy. Oh my gosh. I love that when you looked at your dad's Facebook, it's sharing all your stuff. Beautiful. One thing I struggle with so much, Blake, is something that you talked about in one of your videos, and you've probably written about it too, but it is how we hold these two things in our hands. and I'm speaking we as society, we watch those videos of oh my gosh, I'm going to say it. The baby under the Christmas tree. Look, we adopted your... I'm sorry, I feel sick saying that. Okay. And so people cry and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so, so beautiful. And those same people sharing those videos are sharing the reunion porn, and it's the adults reuniting with their original families. And I have never figured out a way to like hold these two things up to someone and be like, don't you see how messed up this is? What do you say about that? How do you get people to look at those two things and see this is not right?
Well, so I have had to come to the big realization, as unfortunate as it is, that facts will never hold a candle to beliefs. And so you can juxtapose things for people all day long, and I do. I exhaust myself with it. But what I'm starting to realize, I guess, now with my channel and where I hope to take it for the future is that there's a lot of use in, obviously, in unraveling the history and contextual things that I would go to in my channel and some other people have devoted their platforms to. But I'm really interested in this piece about our societal beliefs and values with all of this, because I think that's really where the tension lies, because you're right. There's a lot of people who are just not going to understand why it's important that they see that they're doing two sort of cognitively dissonant things. Because I've had those conversations, and people often have their their earmuffs on to what they're not ready to or don't want to hear. And I'm learning to give people some slack. I think that trauma is one of the number one health crises in the world. I think it's one of the number one crises in the world. You can look at climate change, which is more timely in a way, but what's holding that up? What's holding up earthly destruction? I think trauma has made for people, and in conjunction with the pace of our society in general, has made for people not really wanting to evaluate very deeply about how they act in society or about these things. They have sort of the glass is now overflowing. I cannot take any more information right now. So it's a hard thing you're bringing up. And as far as, you didn't ask this, but, correct ways of approaching that with others, I don't know. I think the art of juxtaposition will always be beautiful. Like, that's just a good way to start, but go ahead. You were going to.
Well, when I saw you start your channel sort of in the beginning, and I saw it shared a lot, and it seemed like it was friends of yours, maybe from school, who didn't necessarily, I don't know them, but didn't necessarily seem to have a connection to adoption. And they were kind of getting on board and supporting you. And I wonder about that. What was it about your friends and they're watching you do these things that those people, why did they get on board to support you?
I think that one of the number one ways to get anybody in a position of better solidarity is through personal relationship. I think it's just hard for some people to grasp what you're about, what you're talking about, what the advocacy work is, if they're not in relationship with either you or somebody else who feels similarly or is involved in some way. I don't know distinctly why. I mean, if it was people from my graduate community, we're a really small cohort and really cool people. So I think just me endlessly gabbing at our residency probably told them, hey, this is worth listening to.
Okay. So going back to this, having a relationship, what do you think about the debates and comments? How much value are we adding to the conversation?
The debates and comments.
Softball question. So we see that dumb video. You wrote this piece. No, that video of the young adoptee recalling, in quotation marks, their adoption is not cute. Okay, so you see that people are sharing it, and there's adoptees and first parents expending their energy in the comment section saying, you guys, like, this is not really cute. Like, this is a trauma response. And,
Yeah.
this person is just parroting back things they've heard. Are we making an impact by I'm going to say it. I think it's a waste of emotional labor to go in there and have these fights when you're saying it's our relationships with existing people that is building the bridge to an understanding about adoption trauma.
Well, and you know what? I think that answer is so open-ended because it's going to depend on the type of people, and it's going to depend on where the person who, like in our subject, is at. If you're talking about another adoptee in your life, it depends on where they're at, because you're going to have an adoptee who's going to say, screw this adoptee, I don't know what they're talking about. But I do think that when it does work out, it is by proximity to others and experiencing their life stories that it is easier to connect to the work. And I do think that that is why somebody like my best friend is espousing things like they are. They work for the school district with me and, can see little things like, oh, I have somebody on my route today who is an adoptee and I'm just noticing all of these things, and it's through living with you, through being so intimate with your story that I can understand this. But you're right. Yeah, there's some people that, but also online is such it's seductive because it's immediate and it's really helped the adoptee advocacy community because of the ability to share and connect over information and to reach out into people's homes and help them feel less isolated maybe in what they're experiencing in their own journeys. But yes, when it comes to informing other people, the quote unquote public, it seems seductive to enter that space to use our advocacy work to the best degree. But for as helpful as it's been to a lot of us, I think I'm learning to let go of the keyboard and realize the change is going to come in person.
I want to hear about that. What
Sure.
are some things that you have learned in your studies that when you do present this particular information to someone, they're like, whoa, really? And they get it. Please tell us the magic sauce.
The magic sauce. Wow. I don't have it. I'm sorry. Yeah. No, I know. I'm a fraud. I don't, I'm so honored and appreciative because so many people reached out through both, YouTube and on Facebook just to say, I've had 2-hour phone conversations with foster parents and other things, just really been able to sit down with community members and receive really kind messages about all of that. But sometimes I do feel like a fraud. There's this impetus or onus on any marginalized community to also be the ones doing the most advocacy work. You just can't expect that power dynamic to suddenly flip. And it can be exhausting. And so I'm not at a place where definitely have I reached, let me put it this way. I've tried with local community organizations to intercede on behalf of events, say, that were about the subject of adoption or, even the fertility industry, foster care. And when I've gone to speak with people, I've walked away ghosted, people aren't ready and I don't know an elevator pitch, I think it takes conversations like you and I are having, and I think it takes as many platforms as possible to just fill the airwaves until people can access from their homes wherever. And there's no excuse anymore because there's just so much information from us, from our community, and from people closest to us who get it. Yeah, I don't have a secret.
Well, and I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, and I was kind of pressing in on this for you,
Sure.
where there's this, your personal experience. And then there's also, of course, your expertise and researching adoption. And so we have our lived experience that we're sharing. And we're most of that is what's available on my podcast, right? People's actual lived experience of being an adoptee. And this is literally how it was for me. And these are my actual emotions, etc.
Right.
Plus putting together that piece, the academic piece and the historical piece and learning all of those kind of things. I love to see the merging of those two things, right? And I've increasingly tried to start doing that on my podcast I don't know if people are noticing that or not, but it's so important, right? Because you mentioned like facts versus beliefs, and how do you shift that, right? How do you shift our lived experience and turn it into a fact for someone?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not really a question. It's just more of a, I think it's something for us to think about, really, to consider when we're, doing this advocacy work and talking publicly. And, I think sharing our story is a piece of it. And I think we also need the proof to back it up.
I think where we're really lucky, but which is hard to synthesize, like people need to know, like, so by the time people are watching, or I apologize, I'm watching you, but listening, by the time people are listening to this podcast, I will have sort of made some changes to the channel, and where I want to take it is much more intersecting with other social issues. So I think where we're lucky is that adoption is extremely multidimensional in other things it touches on. When we talk about race, class, reproductive rights, access in society in general, and at a global size as well. And so I think for me, I'm learning to change the conversation to be less, let me tell you about all these facts, versus let's talk about our beliefs about family, or how we build community, or what does having a child mean? What do child rights mean? Getting people to get personal themselves with it in some way that connects them without, because I've definitely had people who are like, well, I this or that, so I understand what you've been through. No, definitely not. But I do think that there's room to connect to adoption in that, as I said, it's a very multidimensional issue. So
I would love it if you would address, if you're comfortable, talking about being queer in the space.
I am happy to talk about that. It is such a fascinating niche part of the community to be queer and an adoptee at this time, especially. In general, I feel like I've lived in two different closets. Incidentally, coming out as a queer person was much easier than opening up about my adoption specific stuff. But
say more about that.
Totally. Well, I think I can't eliminate the fact that some part of me knew that my family would be okay with it based on who I knew them to be at the time. I came out at 15. I was a freshman in high school. So I can't imagine how scary it must be to, say, be an intercountry adoptee in an evangelical family, which is not to say anything about faith communities. I know some incredible radical progressive Christians in my life, but who is potentially maybe in a more traditional evangelical family who they know will not accept them, and maybe is not a community that's thinking critically about adoption. I can't imagine how isolating that must feel. Because, as I said, I feel like I've had to come out twice. Not only because there's no, I don't know, the expected is straight until proven otherwise or something. I wanted to say guilty, but that's not accurate. But then also just the general lack of knowledge around the adoptee experience, or that there's really anything to discuss, especially in the community I grew up in as a white adoptee in a white adoptive family. So and then it's interesting for our time in the sense that, we have something going through right now, the Equality Act in legislation to try and act as extra protections for queer individuals. Some people don't like using the word queer. I mean it more inclusively than its sort of outdated use. But a lot of and the Equality Act is there in part because of, tied into the Supreme Court cases that are up right now involving discrimination, and then faith-based discrimination in adoption agencies and foster care institution around denying access, to queer couples or queer individuals that would like to participate in those institutions. But what makes it interesting being a queer adoptee at this point, especially somebody with me who has maybe some people might say a little more radical perspective, is that a lot of the discussions coming out at this time around all this use language that shapes discussing children as a right. And what does that mean? I'm trying to think of where some of this is going in our future if we start to talk about children as an equal right. And so I've been called a homophobic bigot or tons of swear words. I think I have like a library of swear words now since I've been doing advocacy work. People have taught me new words, and it's just interesting to feel sort of isolated. And I've had other adoptees who are a part of the LGBTQ plus spectrum come to me and say that by taking stances in spaces where they wanted to call out or bring, highlight issues around adoption, intersecting queer identity, have been called similar things. So, yeah, I actually kind of feel isolated as a queer person in that regard.
That is so interesting, Blake, because I can totally see that, right? You're sort of, I was going to say straddling two communities. No, but you're like fully in two different minority groups, I would call them. And the family preservation sort of fight is very much in juxtaposition, I think, in the LGBTQ plus community, because for a lot of those folks, that's sort of the option to build their family. And so it's so in conflict. That must be really challenging.
Yeah. And I think that's why earlier I brought up why I'm more interested in shifting some of my conversations to social beliefs that touch adoption as an institution. And that would be, as I said, what is family? What is community? And I think that, and I'm going to make an episode on this, so I won't go too far into it, but I think that capitalism has definitely shaped / isolated the way we perform family and community. And when we think back, sometimes when I'm trying to discuss with other queer individuals who maybe don't know so much about child separation trauma and maybe institutional injustices regarding these systems, I have this funny image in my head all the time of some ambiguous indigenous society anywhere in the world back like 400 years ago. And just picturing, not everywhere, I'm sure, but I know people on this continent and in this country who try to uphold that their own communities, tribes, societies were very pro multi-identities, multi-genders, multi-sexualities. And I try and imagine like one of those community figures just waking up one day and being like, I feel really, I need a child. I need a child right now. The thing that I think is missing is that in the way we are currently isolated in context of family and community, where it touches gender and sexuality, is that we don't have those really important community village sort of roles that would have been in place in some parts of the world and still are in some places. But, there were places where queer people were holy figures. You'd go to them to bless your baby, give them a name, give them, So I don't know. I feel like I personally take some issue with movements that embrace equality, where equality is everybody having the same exact thing, because I think it takes out something as intimate and nuanced as what does it mean if we're making children an equal right? So there's a lot of hard conversations to have with that specific piece alone.
No kidding. I felt nervous even just like kind of talking about it, because I'm like, I feel so underprepared to, speak about those things, because I don't know. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what's happening. I'm up in Canada. I mean, it's it's a whole other world up here. No, but I just feel like it's good for people to know that these conversations are happening outside of our bubble. We get so focused in adoptee land, and I've spoken to Liz Laddie about this a few times, and she's really an amazing advocate for adoptees. Yeah. And she also loves to bring this like nuanced conversation and challenges me. And I really appreciate that. Like I want to keep growing. I want to keep learning. I want to keep having an open mind about
Sure.
things, while also still just firmly advocating for adoptees and family preservation in particular. It's good. It's good to hear about what else is going on, and also to figure out what you personally believe and want to work for, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, thank you for bringing that up. And then also thank you for bringing Liz into the room. I think they're great. Yeah.
Liz is awesome. Okay. This was so good. I really want to keep having conversations with you about this, but we need to do our recommended resources.
Sure.
And of course, you guys, I'm going to recommend that you go check out Blake's YouTube channel. He's got some new things happening that you can go look at as well. But Not Your Orphan is just really well-produced videos, very thoughtfully scripted first. Now you know, it's not a secret anymore.
Yeah.
But that, like, the content is so good. And when we talked about this, having conversations and like understanding, what do you say to people? Like, Blake is giving you language. He's giving you information that you can bring up when you have these conversations with your friends and family, and giving you more tools in your toolkit. That's what I think. I've also really appreciated reading your posts on Medium. And so make sure you're following Blake on Facebook and his YouTube channel so that you don't miss any of those things. Again, lots of very good information, and hopefully some more personal stories will start to come out.
I will take your recommendation, your unworded recommendation. Yeah.
My implied.
Yes. Yeah. That's the word.
Okay. What do you want to recommend to us today, Blake?
Well, I said this earlier and I'll say it again, but I feel a little bit biased because, I was going to recommend Haley, y'all, but
I told him he's not allowed to.
If you're watching Adoptees On, then you already know this community. But I feel a little bit biased because another cheerleader of mine since I started my platform has been Reshma McClintock. And I think Dear Adoption is such an important platform out there. I can't stress enough how invaluable something like that would have been had I known about it when I was very isolated growing up as a youth. That anonymity piece, I think, is critical to opening up further dialogue in our community where some people just do not feel ready to or comfortable sharing more personal perspectives. You know, that's where those more complicated conversations get to live, but it really fosters that's a word. A sense of, I don't know, sort of campfire community, very intimate, very, I'm very glad what it brings. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm too biased because Rush is like one of my best friends, but yes, Dear Adoption is like genius. And I mean, I feel like there's a piece for everyone that you can like sit down and read and be like, I could have written this, just because it expresses so beautifully exactly what I'm feeling in that moment. And I too love the option of anonymity. I mean, it just gives people freedom to like really share what's on their minds. In fact, one of my favorite examples of that, and I don't know who this is, Resh is like tight-lipped, okay? But there's an adoptee who wrote a piece about her adoptive parent who is sharing online and is basically saying, hey, can you stop that? Because
yeah.
and it was so interesting because I was like, wow, can you imagine like this is the only place you can say that? Like you're not safe enough to say it to your parents' face. And there's a real power to that.
It's like a living multi-person diary, and it's something that's really safe for people to be able to say, look, there's more personal things I don't feel comfortable sharing with you. But if you go here, the point of this is to have given you access to really personal material.
Thank you so much, Blake. Thanks for going to some places where I don't think you expected me to go. Yeah. I really appreciate that. If people want to connect with you online and follow your work, where can they do that?
Not Your Orphan is on Facebook and YouTube. I also am semi-user of Instagram. You can follow me there. I have a Twitter. And as Haley said, for the month of National Adoption Awareness, I was using Medium a lot to write, and will continue from time to time. So you can follow me there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so, so much. So glad I got a chance to talk with Blake, and make sure you do go and follow him over at Not Your Orphan on YouTube. I think he's going to do some very big things, and seriously wanted to get into so many of the academic behind the scenes things that he is learning and researching about. And I'm sure that he will be teaching us those things on his channel very soon. I'm like half excited, half sad. This is our last episode for 2019. Wow, let that sink in. 2020 is coming. And I am going to take a few weeks off as a holiday break to focus in on my family. Now, I say that, but there's still things happening behind the scenes that you don't see. But we won't be posting regular episodes again until January 17th. So make sure you check back, make sure you're subscribed, and check back in your app on January 17th for all new episodes of Adoptees On. We'll continue on with our weekly schedule at that point. Meanwhile, Adoptees Off Script has 40 plus episodes to binge. If you are into that kind of thing, if you want to hear more adoptee talk that is like more behind the scenes and some more private topics that we wouldn't necessarily discuss on the main show, you can go to adopteeson.com/partner to support the Adoptees On podcast. And that Adoptees Off Script podcast is one of the many bonuses you can get if you sign up to support Adoptees On monthly. I am so grateful for my monthly supporters, because without you guys, I literally wouldn't be able to do the show. So thank you so much. And I hope that you guys have a wonderful holiday season, whatever you are celebrating or not celebrating. I hope that you take some good time to take care of yourself. I hope that you're able to have a few moments of refresh time. I know that not everyone gets to have a winter vacation or time off work. And so the time that you do have to either spend with friends or other loved ones, I hope is meaningful and helpful for you. And I really look forward to talking with you again in 2020. Can you believe it? So we will talk again in 2020 on January 17th. Thanks so much for listening. Let's talk again soon.